Well, let's take two really simple shifts, a shift of demand to the right and a shift of supply to the right. Let's start with a shift of demand to the right. We know at the end we're going to get to this new equilibrium at a higher price and a higher quantity, but how? Well, remember that when demand shifts, it shifts at the same price. So when we shift this curve, the price remains at P1, so we can extend this price along. Let's have a look at the new conditions in the market. Where is demand and where is supply? Well, demand is now here, let's call that QD, whereas supply is at Q1 at a price of P1. Clearly, there is an excess demand. Demand is there, but supply is only at Q1. So if I call that point A and that point B, you can see there is an excess demand equivalent to AB in the market. Now, from my previous video, you know that when there is a disequilibrium, as we see here, where demand is not equal to supply, it's greater than supply, the functions of the price mechanism kick in. Now, we learned from my last video how an excess demand will be taken away, right? Watch that video if you're not aware at this stage. Let's go through. What happens first? Well, a signal will be sent to producers that the price is too low. How will they know? What signal will be sent? Well, they'll start seeing excessive queuing for the product, waiting lists to get this product. There'll be competition between buyers to get it. A clear sign that demand is so high, whereas suppliers can't keep up. That's a signal that the price is too low now in the market. There is an incentive next for producers to change their price. In this case, to increase their price. Why? To milk it, we said from my previous video. Basically, to produce more, to satisfy some of the excess demand. But why? To make profit by doing so. So let's say that producers respond to the incentive by increasing price from P1 to P2. They nail it in one. They produce now a bit more quantity, and as you can see from Q1 to Q2, at a higher price to satisfy some of the excess demand in order to increase their profits. That's their incentive to increase price. If they increase price from P1 to P2, what happens? There's going to be a contraction along the new demand curve and an extension of supply. At this new price of P2 and quantity of Q2, we can see now that there is no more excess demand. The excess demand has been rationed away. That's that function of the price mechanism. And we get to a new equilibrium where there is a perfect allocation of scarce resources because demand equals supply now. So we can say resources have been reallocated at a higher price from P1 to P2 and a higher quantity from Q1 to Q2. That's how we get to this new equilibrium. Amazing. Functions of the price mechanism here. And that happens without any government involvement whatsoever. Adam Smith calls it the invisible hand. Just the pure notion of producers and consumers interacting will sort out any changes in the market. So if demand shifts to the right here and we get a distortion away from equilibrium, the invisible hand, the four functions of the price mechanism will sort out that disequilibrium and will take the market to a brand new equilibrium where we have a brand new efficient allocation of scarce resources. Amazing, really. Now in the real world, that increase in price might not be perfect. There might be numerous price increases until we get to a new equilibrium where the excess demand has been totally rationed away. But you see, that will happen because even if the price rise isn't perfect, there will still be an excess demand. And therefore a new signal will be sent, new incentive to keep raising price, etc., until we get to the point where there is no more excess demand left. Okay, so that's what happens when demand shifts to the right and how we get to a new equilibrium there. What about when supply shifts to the right? We know that when supply shifts to the right, we're going to get a lower price at a new equilibrium and a higher quantity. But how do we get there? Well, remember, when supply shifts to the right, it does so at the same price. So let's take the price of P1, take it across, and look at the new demand and supply in the market. Well, supply is now here at QS, whereas demand is at Q1. There is a clear issue, there is a disequilibrium now. Quantity supplied is much higher than quantity demanded. Supply is higher than demand. There is an excess supply equivalent to AB here. Now from my previous video, again, we know how excess supplies are taken away from a free market. Exactly the same process happens here. First thing that happens is a signal is sent to producers that the price is now too high. How do producers know this? Well, there are excess stocks in the warehouse. There's stock on the shelves in the shop itself that is not budging. So excess has been produced, which the producer can't sell. A clear sign that the price is too high. That's the signal. There is an incentive now for producers to lower their price. And let's say they lower their price perfectly from P1 to P2. Why is that incentive there? Well, to make more profit. To sell the excess stock, to liquidate their stocks, you could say, and make profit from it, instead of it just sitting in warehouses or sitting in the shops doing nothing. The incentive is to lower the price, sell it, and make more profit. So let's say they lower their price perfectly from P1 to P2. What happens? Well, there is going to be a contraction along the new supply curve and an extension of demand. And we see now that we get to a price of P2 and a quantity of Q2. At that price and quantity, there is no more excess supply that exists at all. It's been taken away, rationed away, you can say. And we now end up with a perfect allocation of scarce resources at a new equilibrium. We can say that resources have been reallocated at a lower price of P2 and a higher quantity of Q2 at this new equilibrium where S2 cuts D1. That's how we get there. That is the price mechanism working to reallocate scarce resources when supply shifts to the right. Perfect. And just like before, that reduction in price there may not be in one perfect stage in the real world. There might be a process of continual price cuts until that excess supply is taken away. But as long as there is an excess supply, there is always the incentive to keep reducing price. Just like when there is an excess demand, there is always an incentive to keep raising price until that's been taken away. So even though I've said here in simple theory that it happens in one stage, it might actually take various price cuts. It doesn't matter. The process is always the same. So now you understand how when demand or supply shifts, the market mechanism through its four functions will perfectly reallocate scarce resources through the basic interaction of buyers and suppliers, consumers and producers. No need for governments at all to make sure that resources are perfectly allocated, that there is allocative efficiency. Incredible, this invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about, the four functions of the price mechanism. To make sure you really get it, maybe on your own, work out how when demand shifts to the left, we get to a new equilibrium, and when supply shifts to the left, we get through to a new equilibrium. You'll end up with, again, excess supplies and excess demands, but it's always the same process. Whenever there is an excess supply, it's the same process of how that's taken away. When there is an excess demand, it's always the same process with how it's taken away. So work through those two examples, make sure you get it, and then this topic is nailed. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Make sure you stay tuned for the next video where we continue with our in-depth look at markets. Very important stuff. One of the most important videos really in the entire course covered right here. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.